Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time on this Saturday. I know for many people in the middle of a pretty busy time of the semester, this session on teaching students to podcast. My name is Eric Detweiler, and I'm an assistant professor in the English department at Middle Tennessee State University, just outside of Nashville. My teaching and research is located at the intersections of rhetoric and writing studies and digital media. And I've been making podcasts for about a decade now. I currently run one called Rhetoricity, which is just rhetoric with an ITY at the end. I'll be chairing this workshop, and I'll also be presenting along with Harly Ramsey and Beth Kramer. And I will hand it off to them in just a minute and give them a chance to introduce themselves. But I wanted to first just give you a quick overview of how this hour is going to unfold. If I can remember how to move a Google slide forward. There we go. So we're going to start by just each giving a quick kind of, 7 or 8 minute presentation on different ways that we scaffold podcasting assignments in the courses that we teach. There will be a little overlap in some of the things we talk about, but we'll each hit different points of emphasis. Harly is going to focus on how she introduces students to different podcast genres. Beth is going to focus in particular on teaching students to conduct interviews, and I'll be talking a little bit about a series of exercises that I have students do in a full-fledged podcasting course that I teach. After that, we'll pause for a quick round of Q&A, and from there, we'll shift gears into a kind of more informal roundtable discussion of some of the challenges and possibilities involved in assessing and responding to student podcasts, both in terms of peer workshopping as well as teacher feedback. After that, we'll leave time for another round of kind of more assessment-focused Q&A before wrapping up. And along the way, all three of us are going to be making reference to some course materials that are going to be available in a Dropbox folder we put together. I will drop a link to that Dropbox folder in the chat in just a second, and you should be able to follow along there if you want to sort of pull up any of those documents as we're talking. So with that said, I will hand it off to Harly Ramsey, who's going to be giving the first of our 3 presentations.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks everyone for joining us here. I teach advanced communication for engineering students at the University of Southern California. For the last 3 years, I've included a podcast assignment. So I've taught this to over 300 students, and I've nurtured and graded over 100 podcast episodes. So as a single episode, or a single assignment, podcasting can be very flexible. And that's one of my favorite things about it. It worked very well during COVID, and it can still be adapted using kind of a hybrid online in-class modality too. It could be stretched or compressed depending how much time you need in the semester for the unit. And the scaffolding assignments can mirror or reinforce scaffolding assignments for written work. So for all these reasons, I'm a fan of the assignment. My very favorite thing about it, though, is that the students really enjoy it, and you can tell. In my classes, the vast majority of students listen to podcasts, but they've never made one. So with this assignment, it's like they're looking behind the curtain at the wizard. So part of this looking behind the curtain at the wizard is understanding genre. So I start with that. How is podcasting different from a recorded conversation? I have them read an article by Christopher Drew about educational podcasts, and that's in the file that Eric's going to send the link for. It's very helpful for the students because it lists specific genres and clearly associates moves with each genre. And that's what you see here on the screen. The quick burst is time constrained, very buoyant, a narrative, obviously storytelling, and often will end with links out. And the chat show is conversational tone and wit. So after the students understand the basics of the genres through reading about them, then we listen to some podcasts and have them identify the moves and categorize it. So I always start with a particular podcast that was created by Bethany Gordon, who was then a PhD candidate for an engineering degree. And she made it as part of a student podcast challenge for engineers about how to change the world. I start with it, of course, because it relates to them as engineering students, and their broad writing prompt, or I should say podcasting prompt, is just connect engineering and society. But beyond that, it's just a spot on narrative format, and it's perfect fodder for conversation. It open and closes with a story about a Turkish refugee girl, and she plays an instrument. You hear the music throughout consistently. There's a clear narrative arc. And Bethany Gordon's voice patterns really reflect storytelling with emphasis and pausing and just very engaging. So then the cherry on top is that it has to do with a topic similar to what my students would write about. So they find it accessible and inspiring, both in terms of content, but also format. The format, they could accessibly identify it, and it's inspiring that they could do it themselves. So after that, we listened to a more publicly available podcast, Sandra Singlo, The Lowdown on Science. You're probably familiar with that, and that's a perfect example of a quick burst. It always clocks in under 2 minutes. She always has humor. Her voice is fast-paced, and the students catch all these features. Beyond that, each episode usually discusses one research article. So that primes them for hearing research in the podcast, and that leads into what I do next. So at this point, we don't listen to a chat show. We just talk about different examples that they're familiar with, either from podcasts they listen to, or even perhaps a TV format. And they usually bring up the difference between a single host who kind of monitors a chat show and multi-host chat show. So we kind of leave it at that. And then I pause and introduce the grading rubric again, because now they have a sense of what these features are. I come back to it. And one, I think, very telling feature of the grading rubric is content. The criteria is so similar to a traditional written essay. Of course, the grading rubric has, and I included in the file, Eric will send everyone, it has different categories for production and delivery, but under content, it's what you would all expect. The content reflects thorough scholarly research. The organizing principle is strong and meaningful. The discussion is fully developed and insightful. And the students catch, oh, this sounds what I always do for an essay. What's so different about it? So precisely because the skill set and assessment seems static when the medium changes, it's important for them to really hear how it is incorporated into a podcast. So that's when we listen to this last genre of the chat show together. And as they listen, the differences are clear, and we'll be talking about this, I'm sure, today too. No longer reading out of direct quotes word for word, a lot more signposting to help us follow along. Oh, no. So at this point, we finally listen to the chat show, and that happens to be the genre most of the students decide to make when they make one. And I tell them, listen for the research. Just like I'll be able to hear it when I'm listening to your podcast and grading it, which makes it kind of some motivation for them, you'll be able to identify it when you're listening to it. So let's make sure we can do this together. And as a side note, when I have them listen to this podcast, I also have them sketch a storyboard, and that's practice for another scaffolding assignment. So they're kind of doing these two things at one time. For this, I always use the same podcast. It was created by students in a former class. The premise is that AI has taken over the world and is hosting a chat show, and the students are the guests. The AI robot voice is the host. So a talented music major was part of the team that created this. So it has tons of special effects. including AI created music, which is so engaging for them too. And then the AI robot voice. The AI is named Aiden, Artificial Intelligence for the Destruction of Human Employment Now. So AI wants to take all the human jobs. So the guest speakers are here to talk about their fields and how their fields engage with computers and AI. So their fields are musician, designer, and a computer scientist. So all three start their section with a clear history of their field and their field's integration with machine learning and AI. So the students are hearing this and they're noting how smoothly the research is incorporated. And the podcast ends with AI continuing to upgrade itself as the podcast is going on to the point of singularity. And then eventually tons of sound effects, humans merge with AI as cyborgs. So after listening, the class, we go through the storyboard, they have a clear sense of the intro, the body, the segments of the body, the conclusion, and other elements of the storyboard. And usually someone will note, this podcast is really a narrative with a chat show embedded, and the narrative is AI. And then yes, they understand genre and they understand how they can use it intentionally. So the key takeaways I would offer are these. 1, the podcast assignment is flexible and scaffolding assignments can evolve and change. 2, students really enjoy podcast assignments. And 3, teaching podcasting is a way to teach listening too. Thank you.
All right, and Beth, I will kick it to you with that. I'll keep your slide up for just a second and then take that down so you can share your screen when the time comes.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here and to learn from my fellow presenters today. My name's Beth Kramer. I'm part of the rhetoric department at Boston University. I teach in an interdisciplinary program. So it's a program where I teach concurrently with a humanities professor and a social science professor, and we all have the same students for 2 semesters. So it's a unique program. It's very experiential, and we spend one of those 2 semesters in London. And I just say that all to give you a sense of some of the work and context that goes behind some of our assignments. Today, I'm gonna reiterate some of the things that Harly just said about scaffolding, but I'm gonna really focus in on interview skills, which I found to be a really important part of teaching students to podcast, and one in which they really develop their critical thinking skills in a different type of way. So I'll build on some of her points about scaffolding and research, and then focus in on interview techniques, scripts, and class workshops, and get to storyboards and peer review if we have time. So Eric, if you want to take that down, great. So since this was a workshop, I thought I'd share with you guys a few assignments that I've worked on that have been successful, and just go through some of the process behind them so that you have a better understanding of what you might be able to take away to your own classes. One thing I do want to reiterate is that even though I do teach students how to podcast, I introduce podcasts as text from the very beginning of the semester. So they're listening to podcasts concurrently with reading text, watching videos. And the first semester, we do a large research project that uses serial podcasts as its basis. So they're not producing podcasts, but they're thinking about podcasts as critical texts in a variety of ways, so that when we get to the part where they're going to make podcasts at the end of the second semester, it's not coming out of nowhere. It's something they've been really thinking about for a long time. I teach making podcasts as part of the digital age unit in our program, where we also have a historical trajectory. So we start at the beginning with the Neolithic Revolution, and we end all the way at the end in London with the digital age. So there's a big scope there, and the digital age unit works really well with producing podcasts. I'm just going to share my screen for a moment and pull up, if I can, the assignments that I assign as part of the Digital Age podcast, and another podcast that I've done in London as well. So both of these podcast assignments, like Harly was saying, are use the same type of skills you're going to teach students by assigning traditional papers. And I always tell that to colleagues that are nervous about getting started with podcasts. Both of these assignments are very rooted in traditional research. So I have one assignment called a Digital Age podcast, where students have to research an area or an aspect of the digital age or an aspect of society that's been impacted by the digital age. So they can choose sports, dating, medicine, delivery services, really anything that has my approval. And in the London Ethnography podcast, and I've done this in Boston as well, they do a podcast exploring an area of London, a neighborhood, and thinking about the connection between insiders and outsiders. I've had success in both of these, so I'll kind of go back and forth between them, but both of them definitely have a scaffolding component. So you'll notice that this digital age one starts with a proposal. They have to turn in research notes. There'll be research logs. And the ethnography one also is very scaffolded. They're doing a lot of observation and background research on their areas before we get into anything like interviews. And I do want to emphasize that, because it's one thing I've found is that students are not going to be strong interviewers until they have some knowledge about their topic. And that's something I really work with them on, that we don't really get to the interview stage until we ourselves are sure about our topic, have done some research and background there. So I'll just spend a little bit of time talking about some of the interview workshops that I do with students to help them develop some of those skills. So the first thing I do to help students with interview skills is to do a joint session where we all work on a similar topic and come up with an interview script. So usually I pick a sociological or a paper by a sociologist or a work that we're looking at. So I've done Denier's Sidewalk before, where it's a sociologist that's looking at the homeless population in New York. I found articles about hookup culture on college campuses, and I have the students in small groups think about what kind of questions would you ask this population to get them to open up honestly about this topic. So we start small, we work on it to get to deeper open-ended questions. I really introduce the idea of closed-ended versus open-ended questions, teaching them like how a question like tell me about something is so much more open than a yes or no question. So we start to think about, okay, not just the best questions, but how you would order the questions, right? How you would get them to the much more nuanced, complicated questions a little bit later in your interview, which I know, having been to some of the workshops yesterday, a lot of podcast hosts talk about, getting your interviewee to warm up. So once we do that and they feel comfortable with the idea of a script and what an open-ended and closed-ended question is, I have them work on interviewing each other. They make an interview script to interview a classmate. I have them practice recording it, uploading it, all those kind of technical things we do in class so that they're more comfortable. And then once they've done that, I do one other exercise that, let's see if I can pull my screen up for you as well. Sorry, I don't think I have it quite right here. And I just wanted to show you the New York Times. Can you guys see that? This is a New York Times guide to podcast teaching. It's from 2018, so many of you might be familiar with it, but it's a really great resource. And there's a segment of it called Elements of an Interview. I'll put this in the chat in a moment. And I always do this exercise where I play these 3 clips. It takes less than 10 minutes all in. And then in small groups, we start to think about not just the questions that they're asking, but what makes them good questions. And we start thinking about editing as well. What does it mean to take away a response? What does it mean to leave in a question and only hear portions of the response? What does it mean to hear something with no editing and just a really extended response? So they start to think about some of the ethical issues surrounding interviews. I find this a really helpful workshop to do in class. So those are some of the workshops we do, kind of getting ready for their own project. And then we go back to their projects where there's a lot of work that they still have to do on their own. So you'll notice on these projects, they will still have to turn in a lot of work for me. So they have to show me their own interview script. They will have to show me unedited portions of their interviews. I have them storyboard later on that I know Harly mentioned, and maybe we could talk about later. And then after that, once they have a draft, then I start playing for them some student podcasts. and different segments of it. And we do a lot of work in class where we'll listen to a student podcast, a former student podcast, and think about what's working, what's not working. And then I have them go back and start to make some changes in their own podcasts. So that's a really kind of brief overview of some of the steps that I do to get them to the final product. I will say that this is for a produced podcast, and I introduced the project as that, a heavily produced research exploratory podcast. And then, after this point of the semester, there are many different types of podcasts, but I am very interested in the production as well as the content, even though I grade the content sort of 80-20. And if we have time to talk about assessment, I have rubrics with them as well. So I think that was basically the overview. I could play for you guys just 1 minute of maybe a finished podcast, just to give you a sense of what all these interview and questions come out to in the end, if I can get this to work well. So this is a podcast about shopping in the digital age. And in the first minute, you'll see the student negotiating with not just with the editorial techniques they've learned, but also with using interview skills.
When was the last time you bought something online? I personally placed an order on Amazon.com yesterday.
I just got it yesterday.
Yeah, last week.
A week ago.
A week ago.
A week ago, and it was a pair of shoes.
Now, when was the last time you bought something in store? I went to Target 9 days ago.
2 weeks ago, I believe.
Was like a month ago.
Somewhere around a month ago. Probably.
You don't know, it's okay, just say you don't know.
I don't know. I don't remember.
It hasn't always been like this. Hi, my name is Bella Soto, and today I will be discussing how the digital age has drastically changed the way we shop.
So I'll stop there, but I hope that gives you a sense of how I kind of build towards a produced interview podcast. And I'll turn it over to Eric now.
All right, great. Thanks, Beth. And I know we've had a few people jump in late, so let me just one last time share in the chat a link to our materials for today that should let you access some of the things that that Beth and Harley have already talked about, and I'll be talking about. There is that link for you all in the chat. So let me pull up my screen here real quick. All right, can you all see that all right? Okay, great. Hello again. I'm going to be talking about a series of exercises that I have students do in rhetoric recorded sound, which is an upper level English elective I've taught a few times at my university. You can find a syllabus for that course in the Dropbox folders, Detweiler -syllabus that we shared a link to just a minute ago. In a sense, this is a podcasting course, and the exercises I'm going to describe are meant to prepare students for the final project in the class, which is a collaboratively produced podcast series that's built around a theme created by students in the course. Once they come up with that theme, students break into teams of 3 to 5, with each team responsible for developing an individual episode in the series. While this is kind of a podcasting course, as I said, though, I think it's also important to note in the context of this symposium that it is a course grounded in rhetoric and writing studies. I note this because my university has a College of Media Entertainment that houses a journalism program and recording industry program. So I have to think carefully about how to create and name the course in ways that will complement rather than be redundant with, say, more journalistically inclined podcasting courses that exist elsewhere on campus. So for anyone who's interested in teaching or developing this kind of course, I think that can be an important consideration. Are people teaching podcasting in other ways at your institution? And how can you, in particular ways, align your course with the humanities or the liberal arts so as to play your disciplinary strengths and kind of foster collaborative opportunities across campus rather than, maybe inadvertently stepping on toes? With that said, let me hop into the exercises themselves. So as they prepare to create that capstone podcast series I already mentioned, students do 5 smaller audio exercises. Those exercises are loosely based on a sequence of ancient rhetoric exercises called the Progymnasmata. And I've laid them out in detail in an article that's included in the Dropbox folder, which also has the prompts for each of the following exercises, as well as that final project. One of my goals with these exercises resonates with some of the things that Harly mentioned earlier. Specifically, I want each of the exercises to resemble a particular genre that exists in the world of podcasting, not just an artificial academic assignment, but a standalone audio composition that allows students to practice aspects of the work that's involved in podcasting in manageable, bite-sized ways that are modeled on actual genres that exist and circulate out in the world. The first of those exercises is transcription. In short, students pick a 3 to 5 minute segment of an untranscribed podcast episode and transcribe it. I start with this exercise in large part because I want students thinking about accessibility early on in the course. How can they anticipate and address deaf and hard of hearing audiences, for example? But it's also a chance for them to engage really carefully with the linguistic and rhetorical features of podcasts. So as they transcribe, they begin to recognize things like speakers' syntactic structure and tics, how and where hosts interrupt or trade off with each other, where and how music and other sonic elements kind of weave in and out, and so on and so forth. In the past, I've let students choose kind of any old podcast to transcribe, but when I next teach the course, I plan to provide a couple of clips from shows that are especially editorially and sonically rich so that each student is transcribing the same thing, but in ways that will likely diverge and allow us to have in-class discussions about the different ways students transcribe the same segment and the rhetorical choices involved in transcription and represented in their various approaches. It's also to keep students from transcribing clips from loosely edited discussion podcasts, where honestly, there's just sometimes not all that much going on editorially or sonically speaking. And I'll just mention on a quick side, I typically use them or have them use ExpressScribe, which is a free software, or the site otranscribe.com for this activity. The second exercise, resonating with some of what Beth talked about, is an interview. Basically, a student has to record an interview with anyone on any topic, capturing at least 10 minutes of raw audio that they subsequently cut down to 3 to 4 minutes. So in addition to giving students experience with interviewing, the length discrepancy between the original recording and the final cut requires students to make some careful and often difficult editorial decisions. You know, what's most important or interesting, and what, even if the student is attached to it, needs to end up on the cutting room floor. How do they cut down the audio without making it incomprehensible for listeners who weren't privy to the full cut? We also talk about different styles of interview editing, including interviews that leave the interviewer in and so-called non-narrated interviews that remove the interviewer entirely and make it sound more like the interviewee is just telling a story instead of being interviewed. The third assignment requires students to tell a story. In tandem with readings on narrative theory and the storytelling conventions of podcasting, students have to pick an event, however seemingly mundane, that they witnessed or experienced between when they receive the assignment prompt and the day the exercise is due. They then script and narrate that event in a 3 to 4 minute audio piece that incorporates at least one piece of supplementary audio, a song, a sound effect, etc. That gives students some practice with writing and reading for the ear, with narrative structure, and with a teeny little bit of sound design. And then the fourth exercise really drills down on sound design. So students have to pick a location on our campus and create a 2 to 4 minute soundscape that evokes that place. I'm clear with students that this cannot just be a field recording, though a field recording of their location can be a component of the exercise, and that it shouldn't include any straightforward narration or voiceover. Their goal is to conjure up the location for listeners through actual and artificial nonverbal sounds, not spoken description. And so this assignment gets students working with layering and intertwining multiple audio tracks and thinking really carefully about the rhetorical possibilities of sound design, both on its own and as a subcomponent of many podcasts. And the last one is admittedly a little bit of an oddball, but it's one that students, I think, often have a lot of fun with. And it's an imitation exercise where students have to record themselves delivering the Gettysburg Address and they have to do historical research to make their edited recording sound as much like they think the original speech would have sounded as possible. So that could include research on, Abraham Lincoln's vocal qualities, the weather on the day of the speech, the crowd size, the bird species native to central Pennsylvania, and so on and so forth. So in addition to helping them think about the research that can go into podcasting, it builds on some of the narrative and sound design, delivery, and editorial skills they practiced in the previous exercises. So all told, students wrap up these 5 exercises with concrete experience with transcription, interviewing, writing scripts, storytelling, sound design, editing, single and multi-track audio projects, and research. We don't cover every possible permutation in the world of podcasting, but students are equipped with a set of technical and rhetorical skills they can take with them into the capstone podcasting assignment. That podcast has to be narrative driven, telling nonfiction stories in or across episodes. So I tell students this cannot just be sort of a loosely structured chat or like discussion or interview podcast. And based on the exercises, students come to the final project with experience with all manner of approaches and skills for crafting and editing audio stories, from interviews to scripted narratives to sonic touches, all those different parts that can be combined into a narrative as they play with and develop that project. And so I will leave off there and we can transition into our first round of Q&A. You all are welcome to just post your questions in the chat. We'll keep an eye on that. Or if you'd prefer to ask them out loud, just use that raise hand feature that Zoom has, which you can find by clicking the little reactions menu item at the bottom of the Zoom window. And we'll let people queue up that way, as well as ask questions in the chat. And then sort of time allowing in a little bit, we'll talk real quickly kind of about assessment questions and issues here, and then let that lead into a final second round of Q&A. Let me scroll down in the chat here. So see a couple comments that have come in. So Abigail has asked if we can talk a little bit more about storyboards versus outlines. And I believe, was that Beth or was that you, Harley, who talked a little bit about storyboards and outlines?
I think we both did.
Okay.
Mine is probably less developed than Beth, so I'll go first and let her fill in the gaps. For me, I show examples of both, like visual storyboards from cinema, and my students always choose to do more of the outline sketch. So what I ask them to include would be break down as much details as they can and to estimate the time. And the reason I do that as a scaffolding assignment is because very often they're off on their time estimates. So that lets them see the value of practice recordings too, so that they could kind of hone that in. But I would say for me, it's very similar to an outline.
Yeah, I would agree. Mine sounds very similar to yours, Harley. The assignment I do before the final podcast assignment is a photo essay. So they have to storyboard that too. And they are used to kind of visually thinking about the idea of a storyboard versus just an outline. So I do think that helps when we get to the podcast. I also, like Harley, have a very simple chart where on one side, they have to describe in as much detail what they're going to be doing, who's going to be speaking, and how long they think it's going to take. And they have to indicate when there'll potentially be sounds in between, whether it's background music or other types of recording or clips that they want to use. And it is really important for them to start to think about, do I have enough information or do I have way too much information? And usually it's the latter. They usually have too much they want to put in. And when you finally tell them this is going to be 10 to 12 minutes, it's hard for them to make some of those choices. And it really teaches them a lot about design and principles and argument to have to get it to that phase. So I do find it's similar to an outline, but because it has these different components, it pushes them a little bit more.
And also I think outline puts them back in that written mind frame, that this is an outline for an essay. So that's one reason where mine isn't extravagantly different. I think it's important to show them different visual storyboards and explain the history of the concept, and then have them think of it within that mind frame.
Cool, great. Thank you both for that. So I'll jump to I think what is the next question in the chat here, and this is from Kenneth, and it is, I am interested in your thinking about publishing student work, whether a real anticipated audience is something you want students to think about. And I can say something real quick here, and then I'll hand it off again to Harly and Beth. So on one hand, I don't require students to actually publish what we create in the class, for a lot of reasons that run from like student privacy concerns to other kind of stuff that may be too much to get into here. But I do really want them thinking about a real audience. One of the things that I'm kind of a broken record about when I talk to people about podcasting assignments is when you say you're teaching podcasting, are you really teaching like an audio essay or just like a one-off audio assignment? Or are you really teaching podcasting, in which case the second half of that word suggests some kind of like circulation and distribution, that you're going to send it out into the world, and all of the questions of sort of seriality and distribution and things like that come into that. So I'm typically asking students along the way to think about things like who would your audience for this podcast likely be? You know, how broad or narrow or specialized a net are you trying to cast? What kinds of editorial sort of decisions are you going to make? Do you have like a canned intro and music at the start of every episode to build a sense of identity and consistency for your audience? Or is that going to vary a little bit? If you were to develop a web presence, like what would the hosting services that you choose be? Would you have it really centralized on a site, or would you mostly be going through like, Apple Podcasts or Stitcher or places like that? And so we're doing a lot of research and looking at kind of the distribution and circulation technologies and infrastructure that's involved in podcasting, even if I'm not requiring students to put the class project out there, so that students could be able to jump into that if they so choose after the course, and really just make sure along the way that they're making sure to think. And I mean, I'm a writing teacher, so I'm talking about audience in every class, but especially in the case of podcasting, what's involved in attracting, developing, and kind of defining your audience, and what it would look like to sort of circulate in the world. I'll mention real quickly just to Corinne's question that just dropped in the chat. I'll say the last time that I taught this class this was actually Abigail, and I'll save Corinne's for just a second. Last time I taught it, students actually chose to make the series about sound. And so like there was one episode that was on sound design and film. There was one episode on like Foley work. There was one episode that was on like cultural appropriation in various American musical traditions. And so sound itself ended up kind of being the focus of the series. There was another time where students did magical thinking in American culture. And there was like one episode on conspiracy theories, one episode on like the popularity of fantasy in American culture as like a fiction genre and things like that. So that's the kind of things that that students often dig into. And from there, I will pause and let Harly and Beth follow up on this question before I turn forward to what Corinne's got in the chat there.
Yeah, Harly, do you want to take it next?
Okay, sure. Yeah, I agree. I'm also a writing instructor, so this sense of audience is so important. I kind of split the difference, and I have my assignment prompt says consider it a demo tape for an upcoming podcast on engineering and society. So they have that sense of a particular audience. And I do have the students share all the podcasts with each other, and then we kind of debrief and have a writing assignment about it. But audience is super important for sure. I think those were my main points, except that I did read one of Eric's articles that he has in there, and he mentioned like podcasting truly would be distributed. And I was like, yeah, I agree. And I'm hoping to be able to get there someday where these demo tapes can actually be, voluntarily turned into something. But that issue of the three of us, when we met once, we talked about how voice is so vulnerable. So I wouldn't demand that a student, publish something, for the public.
Yeah, I would reiterate a lot of what you both have just said. I have in the past sometimes set up a media gallery on Blackboard where they can upload their podcasts and hear each other's, but there are so many privacy concerns with putting things out publicly. There's also sometimes copyright issues where I have students that really want to use clips from the media or things like that. And I'll tell them, we can do it for this because it's going to be just for educational purpose for in-class purposes. But if you ever want to disseminate this more broadly, we're going to have to get different types of permission. So it is a good way to sometimes teach things about copyright and other types of issues that do arise when it comes to citation in a different way with sound. I will say, like Eric did, we talk about audience all the time. I'm trying to imagine audience and resistant audience sometimes for topics. And I do assign an episode of The Daily where they listen to one that's quite critical of Amazon and then think about some of the ads that are then focused on in that podcast. And it does help them see some of the ethical concerns with these that arise with podcasts or just disseminating arguments, in the corporate atmosphere we often live in. So that sometimes come up when we talk about these topics.
Well, great. I was just dropping one last time for anybody who joined late, the Dropbox link to some of the materials we're talking about, as well as a link to our slides. And let me scroll back up to Corinne's question, which was, what kind of support do you provide students in relation to the mechanics of recording and editing? Do you suggest programs for them to use and or provide guidance on how to use them? And what kind of recording equipment do you expect them to use? And Harly and Beth, I'll give you all the first word on this one before I jump in.
Okay, Beth, you go first this time.
Sure. Yeah, I know when you're first starting out teaching students the podcast, this is probably the most intimidating part, that you feel that you're not an expert and then you're asking students to do some quite technically complicated things. But I found I usually give student choice. So even though at BU we have access to Adobe Suite, so I teach them Adobe Audition, and that's what I'll do some in-class workshops on. I do give them the option to use GarageBand or others if they are familiar with, because I do want them to be comfortable with using these type of programs at the end of the day. I found there's so many resources online now and so many videos that my work in class has gotten smaller and smaller. And then I send them lots of video clips and then we do some things in class together and really have them just try it out. When I have the time during the summer, because we meet in very long blocks, sometimes it's just a matter of being there to troubleshoot while they try things out. And I found that to be very useful. I know not every class would be have that flexibility, but I'll sometimes set up an extra hour or two on the week where they're really going to be doing a lot of editing, just to be there where they're trying some of these techniques out. But I do find that there's so many resources online and that students are so tech savvy that it's never been the stress I thought it would be. And usually I'm really impressed with the products I get. What about you, Harly?
Almost always in every group, there's one student that is tech savvy, like you're saying, and they kind of do the heavy lifting for it. But I find it's important to spend at least part of a class going over the logistic, the actual editing and how you do it, so that other students can understand why it's important to have a quiet background, so that they don't have their editor try to do all this equalizing and all this technical stuff. I do have tutorials on Blackboard for them that I had former students make. I was lucky and had a grant for that. They just have a short video about Audacity and GarageBand. And also with that same grant, I was able to get podcast coaches that come into the classroom. So I use that for the technical session, because that way they're more near peers explaining to each other and hands-on doing it. Before COVID, I actually brought in microphones and had, podcasting kits. But with COVID, they didn't even need that. So this semester, I haven't brought those back, because then the students would be sitting around a microphone with masks, and that doesn't make any sense either.
Yeah, and I'll say for my part, I have been fortunate to always be able to teach this class in a computer classroom. They're not the most high-powered machines in the world, but they get the job done. And on those, we have Audacity installed. So I'll usually have like a couple class sessions that's basically just like, hey, I've put a couple audio files in our LMS or something like that. Just like open them up. Here's how you add them in Audacity, and just start playing around with all the different settings. We do have a pretty well-known recording industry program at MTSU, and I get some of those students sign up who have been like audio editing, 8 hours a day for years, and really bring a lot of expertise and could use much more high-end tools that they have access to through that program. But I'm using Audacity in that case because it's open source. There's no cost attached, and students can download that on a variety of different platforms and be able to use that outside of the classroom after getting some initial familiarity with it in our classroom. I walk them through kind of some basic sort of Android and iPhone like voice recording apps that are available, and talk a little bit about some very simple and inexpensive like mics that you can plug right into a phone, or sort of low-end USB mics that you can use to up the quality of a computer recording. And so I guide them to those, but to try to minimize costs for my course, I don't require students to have one, and basically say, if you've got a smartphone, that can be a simple way to get this done. And then for students for whom that's not a possibility, one of the libraries on our campus allows students to check out digital audio recorders for like oral history projects, things like that. So students are able to check those out without any kind of cost if they really need access to some kind of recording device outside of the classroom. I will, are there some examples of good mobile audio app recorders? I can add some links to our Dropbox after the fact on that. Let me just pause real quick because we're getting some good some good questions still coming into the chat, but I know we'd said we wanted to talk a little bit about assessment. And so Beth and Harley, I will allow you to jump in before I start talking about that. But maybe if each of you just wants to talk for a couple minutes about some of the assessment questions, whether it's in terms of how you respond to student projects, or how you sort of, I know you mentioned those podcast coaches, Harley, if you want to talk about sort of like peer engagement or things like that. Maybe if we just take a couple minutes a piece on those kinds of issues, and then we can reopen the Q&A in case anybody has questions along those lines.
Do you want to kick off, Harley?
Okay, sure. I think I have a lot of formative assessment, and I think that's so important because it's such a new thing for the students. So all along, I would consider, the storyboard is an assessment. I have them do a pitch, that's an assessment. So it's important that they get feedback often. I will say when I first did this assignment, it was very difficult for me to assess/grade them because it was vocal and their voices seemed so much more embodied that I was judging them more. And that was something that led me to create the rubric I have now, because before I just used a very oral presentation rubric. So that's where I think it's important for me anyway, to link to skills that we discuss together that they should all be able to do. And I do have, as Eric mentioned, the podcast coaches come in, and that would be, they don't do any formal assessing or any grading, but it gives them sort of, I would say, a buffer between, the final product being assessed and having somebody more experienced provide feedback too. So that is a nice way to leverage that. Granted, that's a luxury, and I've only had it for, the last year or so, but I, in other classes, have students kind of come back even on a volunteer basis, or I give them like a, gift card if you can't get a grant. And a lot of them love the assignment. So that might be something that you could, work out, or if you have a TA, do. But yeah, I think the key to assessment is to have it be formative as well as that summative assessment of the final podcast.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. In my course, they get a Blackboard grade. So all the smaller assignments they're doing is part of the scaffolding, like the proposal and the working bib and the research log. They know they're going to get a grade for that. And I give some feedback on that as they're working on it. So there is that portion before they get to the final podcast. I'll share with you guys just for a second my rubric that I won't talk about too much. This I put together because we had a workshop with the Center for Interdisciplinary Teaching at BU, and they helped us generate these rubrics for our classes. And the basic takeaway from mine is that despite all the technical things I'm requiring of them, it's 80% content, 20% style, basically. And you'll see the biggest things that I look for in the podcast are things I look for in traditional essays: analysis of evidence and argument, and larger significance and reflection. Like what is your argument? How much evidence are you basing it on, and why does it matter? How are you making your audience feel that? So for me, as Harly said, there is something very personal about these that makes them feel a little different to grade than your traditional essay. But at the end of the day, the kind of skills that I'm looking for are very similar. And I found having a rubric like this, where it's clear to them how much is going to be your technical audio design and your style of your podcast, and how much is going to be content, has been really helpful. What about you, Eric?
Yeah, so I'll try to hit two main things here. And I'll mention from the get-go, in almost all of my classes for about, I guess, a decade now, I've been using portfolio-based kind of assessment models that are kind of in line with a lot of work on like ungrading that's come out recently. I really specifically use a system called the Learning Record, which I'll drop a link to in the chat there. But essentially, in my podcasting class, as with others, I don't give students quantitative grades on anything. I give them a lot of qualitative feedback, but no quantitative grades. And then basically at the midterm and final, they're responsible for curating a body of work that they've done in the class, which can include things they actually turned in, as well as all kind of, sort of drafty, unedited materials, screenshots of things that I wouldn't have otherwise seen. And the students, based on a set of sort of learning objectives for the course, are charged with making the argument for the grade that they deserve based on a defined but flexible set of grading criteria. So basically what that allows me to do is assess student work based on and in conversation with student reflection. Because, I'm getting students who are journalism and English majors who have a lot of experience with writing and can really bring that to the table, but may have never opened up an audio editor in their life. And I've got students, like I said, from that recording industry program who may dread writing, but have a whole bunch of expertise in audio editing. So it's really hard to assess them all based on a standard set of like baselines that I can expect them to bring to the course. And so that kind of approach gives me a lot more flexibility. And the other thing that I will say, which I think gets back to Kim's question in the chat a minute ago, how are you assessing their delivery and narration? There's a lot of work in rhetoric and writing studies, and I know this happens in other fields as well, but on anti-racist writing assessment that I have found very useful and influential, and basically talking about how in more traditional writing courses, we're often assessing student writing, based on arbitrary sort of notions of standardized English that have to do with the forms of language that white people in power have spoken and written in throughout American history. And one of the things that I think is really distinct about podcasting assignments in some ways is that there's not some of that baggage that comes with some of the more defined genres of academic writing that are often the subject matter of like first year writing courses. So for example, we listened to an episode of the show, Code Switch, called Talk American, that gets into a lot of these issues and basically gives students a sense that like there is not one right way or right language or right dialect or anything like that to deliver your narration in these episodes. And so again, it's the goal is to give students a sort of framework and a vocabulary to be able to reflect on and make the case to me for all the different ways they might have sort of delivered and narrated their assignments. There's a lot of principles we work through in the course, like we read Out on the Wire, a book by Jessica Abel. That's the textbook for the course, which is all about sort of like storytelling principles for radio and podcasting. So, I'm expecting students to be able to frame things in terms of some of the readings that we've done and the sample podcasts that we've listened to, and articulate decisions and rationales for how they've approached it, but in a way that gives them a little bit more flexibility. There's also a long section in that book that's about the sort of editorial and producer feedback stage of podcast and radio creation. And so I make a lot of use of that as well. Yeah, thanks. Kim has just dropped a link to that excellent and pretty affordable book in the chat. I don't know, Beth and Harley, I'll give you a chance to follow up on Kim's question, and then from there we can scroll back up to Kenneth's real quickly as well about how we manage group editing, particularly outside of class.
So assessing delivery, yeah, that's something that could be difficult. What I do is, again, go to intent, that if they choose a chat show, then it's more conversational, and they shouldn't be reading word for word. And that's something that they identified as features themselves. So when I can, I tie delivery to the genre, again, for intent. And what my students like about podcasting is that if it doesn't sound how they want it to sound, they get to do it again. So that's very liberating for them.
Yeah, in terms of group editing, I sometimes do some workshop projects for them where it will be more of a kind of chat episode, or we'll practice kind of discussing topics, but I don't have a lot of group editing that's graded. So it is more informal in my class. So I don't have a ton of experience in terms of assessing that, but I kind of agree with Harley's take there. I know if I was to do it more, I'd probably give ways in which I was pulling out individual grades versus kind of group effort, and always helping them see some of that difference. Because I do a debate project where I have to give a group grade and also individual grades. And I usually really clear about what those two criteria might be. Eric, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, if we're jumping into the editing stuff, when I last taught this class, I just set up a Slack team with separate channels for each episode that students could use, because frankly, our LMS does not have the capacity to let students share large audio files in a useful way. And, I would sort of walk them through, like, here's all the different ways that you can use Slack, where you can upload stuff, how it kind of operates. And then I would meet individually with the student groups to basically help them establish a timeline. Like, when are you going to be handing off files from scripts to audio projects to, WAV files to whatever, from one group member to another, and making sure that that is happening at a set time, so that somebody isn't, expected to do 24 hours worth of work in 2 hours or something like that. Now, frustratingly, but also understandably, my university has gotten a lot more strict about what digital platforms we can have students use since COVID and the move to online classes. But we do, have a Microsoft Teams account that we can give students access to. So that's kind of another, Slack adjacent kind of platform. But it's basically helping them see, like, what the workflows of those platforms look like, and making sure that they're setting up clear, defined timelines for who's doing what and who's going to hand what off to whom when, to make sure that they can hit kind of the deadlines they're going to need to get these projects done. I know we are at time, essentially. So thank you all for making the time for this today. I'll drop my email address in the chat, and I'm happy to talk with anybody who wants to follow up more after this. But thank you all for being here. And thank you, Beth and Harley, for your great presentations and discussions here today. And they've got their emails in the chat as well. Thank you all again.